Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 260, and we're going to talk about slavery. And I chose a topic that probably a lot of you are familiar with, so that if my voice bugs you, you don't have to listen. You won't miss much. But I figured if I could lecture all day at school to middle schoolers with this voice, I can do a podcast episode with this voice. But again, if it bothers you, you can, not listen since it's just slavery, right? But anyway, there's a lot in the news today, but I've been in school all day, so I haven't been able to check up on social media or even listen to my normal podcast routine. My wife did tell me that the big guy pardoned his son, and it makes you remember how important and how powerful political privilege is. Makes white privilege kind of a joke, really. Anyway, so in class today, it came up that slavery is a form of labor. And most of the students that I teach are African American. And so I wanted to make sure that they all understood that slavery is the most expensive form of labor and is just really not worth it. So we have to realize that if you want to make the case that slavery is in fact a good form of labor, you're making a pro-slavery argument. And we wouldn't want to do that, right? So what makes it expensive, more expensive than other forms of labor? Well, if I was a slave, every night I would dream about how I would kill my owners, right? There would be no hope of escape. I would never get free. And I would rather die trying to kill my owners than to live and die as a slave. So there's that. You got to realize that all of your slaves are at a certain point entertaining the idea of taking your life, right? So how do you sleep at night knowing that, on some plantations, right, there's like 1,000 slaves. And if they all decided that they were going to end your life, then what are you going to do to stop that? So even if I was forced to work, you have to realize that it's forced labor. And so slaves would only work as hard just so that they don't get beaten or punished, right? So you figure out how much work you have to do at minimum so that you can avoid a beating, and you never do more than that. You don't even think about doing a more efficient, a better quality job, how to do the job faster. You don't think about that. It makes me think about The Bridge Over the River Kwai, that movie where British prisoners were forced to make a bridge for the Japanese, but they were essentially slave labor. And I remember that there was some controversy. It's been decades since I've watched it, but I thought it was interesting that some of the troops were like, why do you care so much? We're slaves, right? And then the one officer seemed like he had pride in his work. That seemed to be the excuse. Also, even when it's no longer the season where you're going to use your slaves, you still have to provide for them housing, food, clothing, right? Because you need a healthy slave to do work. Sick slaves don't do good work. So you have to make sure that they are taken care of, even when they're not working. And it's so lopsided in terms of the benefit, the monetary benefit of slaves, that self hire or quasi free slaves were a big thing in the South. I had talked about this in another episode that had to deal with slaves, but yeah, it was just too expensive. And so a lot of slave owners would allow their slaves to go and get jobs as long as they paid a cut to the slave owner, right? So they were able to make a little bit of money in the off season, and the slaves were glad to do it because they were getting paid. Eric Allen, who was a slave, bought his own freedom that way. He earned enough money to buy his own freedom, and he became the pastor of the first black church here in Philadelphia in 17 in the late 1700s, before 1800 even. And he was able to buy property and build his church here in Philadelphia. It was pretty crazy, right? So it was a big thing, right? Slavery is just so expensive that the owners just can't make a profit with just the slave labor itself, right? It's just lost too much money. So it's coercive. There's no incentive to work harder, to innovate, to become more efficient, right? And you're constantly losing money. Whether the slave is sick, you still got to take care of the slave. If the slave is too old, too young, you still have to take care of that slave. Now, compare that to paid labor, wage workers. So, what if slaves were laying bricks and they decided and figured out that 200 bricks per day, right? Laying 200 bricks per day is all that a slave could do. Let's just say, just for argument's sake. And so, if I was paying people, I would say, look, a good slave can lay 200 bricks per day. I will pay you a penny per brick or per 5 bricks or whatever, right? But something which might seem like a small amount of money. I'll pay you a penny per brick. And so if that was the case, then bricklayers would constantly be trying to figure out how to lay more bricks to get paid more money. And so a person is constantly thinking, how can I carry more bricks? How can I shorten the distance between where the bricks are and where I have to lay them? Yeah, right? You're constantly thinking of faster ways of laying bricks, maybe even inventing a machine that will lay the bricks for you. And I know, unions, they try to protect bricklaying jobs, but I mean, let's face it, there are machines that can lay bricks very, very quickly. So what you have to realize is that in a slave economy, there's no improvement. There's no greater wealth creation. In the Civil War, our textbook always talks about how the South was really poor. It just occurred to me that I probably sound a little bit like RFK right now. Anyway, it always talks about how the South was really poor. They had no railroads. Had no equipment. In Gettysburg, they figured out that the South was in Gettysburg because a bunch of soldiers were in town looking for shoes. They didn't even have shoes. So some slave owners might have benefited a little bit from having slaves, but the cost that it imposed on society as a whole is huge. They sacrificed improvement and prosperity. The overall wealth and standard of living of the entire South suffered because of the slave economy. I mean, think about all of the poor whites, right? Non-slave owning whites, which made up most of the society in the South. They couldn't get work. I mean, why would you hire a white person if you could get a slave to work for you at a cheaper rate? Those of you who watched Shawshank Redemption or any prison movie, you know that prison labor squeezes out or pushes out all of the competing private companies because prison labor can charge less for its labor because they're already provided for. They're paid for by the state. Their prison, their food, their housing is already paid for. And so they can underbid pretty much everybody else for contracts, which is why using prison labor might sound like a good idea, but the effect that it has on the private sector is enormous. Right? You can't have any kind of competing businesses in the area because the prison labor would constantly underbid anything that you could possibly offer. So I've said before that a lot of people want to believe that slave labor is good labor and cheap labor because of reparations, right? They want, a lot of people today want reparations. People want the descendants of former of slaves to be paid because the slaves themselves were not paid, but they created so much wealth. That's why the United States is so prosperous today. It's because they had all of this slave labor, and that simply is not true. One could make the argument easily that the wealth was generated in spite of all of the slaves that were here in the United States. And so slavery has to be a viable form of labor, a cheap form of labor, a cheap form of good labor, so that they can demand for reparations. And it's so amusing to me that to be an anti slave person today, you have to be pro slavery, right? And the inability of so many people to think critically, to be able to think beyond the superficial, is just so rare to find today that a lot of university professors can get away with making such a ridiculous argument, that on its face is just ridiculous. But that's all I've got for you today. That's all I think my voice can handle. I hope you made it to the end. And hopefully my voice will be better tomorrow after a good night's sleep. Have a good night. Talk to you next time.